Hello viewers, today CCR TV is proud and privileged to have a very distinguished member on our panel. She is none other than Dr. Ligia Noronha, and she is the current Assistant General Secretary at the United Nations based in New York. She is also the head of the Department of Environment at New York. She is a PhD from the London School of Economics, and as you all know, the London School of Economics is a very prestigious institution, and she has got a PhD from there. She has over 20 years of experience in environmental matters, and I'm going to ask her just a few questions before she tells us what are her current responsibilities at the United Nations. So Dr. Ligia, thank you so very much for being with us. I will only ask you one question and then I'll leave it to you. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background before you became the Assistant General Secretary of the United Nations?
Thanks so very much, Basil, and thank you for inviting me here. It's indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here. I came back from London School of Economics and I was in Goa, and I've been working in Goa for very many years. Originally, I started working on development issues, but then increasingly on the development environment interface. And the development environment interface in the context of Goa, as you well know, is to do with the fantastic ecosystems that Goa has and the interconnection between human well-being and ecosystems in Goa. The ecosystems here not only provide well-being, but they also provide economic opportunities for us in coastal tourism, mining issues with regard to fishing and others. So I've been working on many of those while I was here in Goa. And then I went to the Energy and Resources Institute in Delhi. And in Delhi I was working more on resource security, on energy efficiency, on technologies and trade and other aspects of the development environment interface, which are more at the national level. But also very much on mining issues. And a lot of my work has been on mining issues. After that, I joined the United Nations Environmental Program as a director of the Economy Division, which at that time was known as the Division of Technology, Industry and Economics. This division is a very interesting division which actually looks at what drives the environmental problems. And the 8 years that I was there, I worked on getting the division to focus on three very key aspects of what needed to be done to address environmental issues. This was what we call decarbonizing, so decarbonizing the economic system, detoxifying, especially because of all the pollution that we have, and thirdly, looking at decoupling economic growth from environmental footprints. So we call them the 3 Ds. And this allowed us to really focus on ways in which you could pass the message on carefully and clearly to people, but also look at ways in which you could address this from an economic and development and social perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's been a long history there, and as you can see that Dr. Ligia has really worked very, very hard to get the environmental issues forecast to all of us. I will now leave you with Dr. Ligia. She'll tell you more about her responsibilities at the United Nations as the Assistant Secretary General. And before that, I will just say thank you, Dr. Ligia, for being with us, for sharing your immense knowledge on environmental matters with us. And we are so proud to have a Goan at such a high level in the world. It's a great message for our youth that Goans can reach the very, very top if they really strive and work hard. So this message is particularly for our young people out there, saying that it is not impossible to get where Dr. Ligia has got. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you very much again, Basil, for inviting me. I'm really happy that this is focused on the youth, because I work a lot with the youth. UNEP works a lot with the youth, because a lot of the work that the United Nations Environmental Program does is with the youth, because it is to do with intergenerational equity and having the long view. Environmental matters are not of today. Environmental matters are a long-term issue as of today, but also of tomorrow. And as you know, we've had a number of multiple crises, not just the 3 planetary crises that we talk about, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, but there's also been inequality, which has been growing, and there's also been conflict. And strangely enough, many of these are interconnected or can get interconnected. This year, the year 22, the year that has just ended, not 23, but the year that has just ended, has been a year of, in a way, a strengthened environmental multilateralism. Right through the year, there have been a number of global agreements that actually suggest some kind of a strengthened thinking on environmental matters. And let me talk to you about that, because it might suggest that there are things which are happening which can suggest a new and more hopeful way of thinking about environmental matters. Let's start with the United Nations Environmental Assembly, the 5th one in February, which actually came up with very good resolutions, 2 of which are of special importance. One is the decision to have a global agreement on plastics. As you all know, plastics has become a real menace across the world, not only in terms of what it does to the marine population, but what it does to all of us in terms not just of the aesthetics, but also of health and other issues. So there is now a decision to work towards a global agreement on plastics. There was also a decision at the United Nations Environmental Assembly to come up with a science panel on chemicals and waste. We have a panel on climate change, as you know, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is IPCC. We have a panel on biodiversity, IPBES, it's biodiversity and ecosystems. We have an international resources panel, which looks after issues of resource use and natural resource management. But now there's going to be a panel on chemicals and waste, and we are working towards designing and developing this as a multilateral agreement. So the UNEA 5.2 in February was very useful from the point of view of a number of resolutions, but these 2 were the key ones. Then in May, there was very significant advances in the UNCCD, which is the Convention on Desertification. It moved forward in terms of how to address desertification. Then in June was Stockholm Plus 50, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a bit, because I was intimately involved in the Stockholm Plus 50. It was an important meeting, but I will come back to this in a moment. Then we had in July the UN General Assembly actually adopting or recognizing the resolution on human rights to a clean, sustainable and healthy environment. This is a very important resolution because it enables us to ensure that we have a stake in demanding a clean and safe environment for us as individuals, for us as states, for us as countries. Then we had in November the climate COP, the COP 27. You know that we have the climate COPs every year, but this one was very special because it dealt with an issue which is very important to the developing countries and to countries that are affected by climate change. This was the issue of loss and damage. For 30 years, there's been this discussion on loss and damage, but this COP actually addressed it and focused on it. And then in December, we had a very important agreement on biodiversity, which is the COP 15, which came up with the Kunming Montreal framework on biodiversity, which has 4 very clear goals on how to address biodiversity, whether it is to do with the conservation of biodiversity, sustainable utilization, benefit sharing, or the means of implementation to have all of this happen. So this year has been particularly rich in terms of environmental developments, environmental agreements. And if you think about it, you can pull out 5 key trends of what is it that is common to this. One is a recognition of these crises, not just the planetary crises, but also the fact that you have the inequality and the conflicts happening side by side. So all of this makes it very important that environment is not seen just by itself, but in the context of development, in the context of peace, in the context of security, in the context of health, because as you know, the COVID connection also is related to the environmental issues. It also spoke and speaks to the issue of justice and trust. When you think about it, in all of these negotiations, the issue of environmental justice is coming up considerably. If you listen to the climate COPs, if you listen to biodiversity COPs, there's been this focus on environmental injustices. Who is causing the environmental disruption and who is bearing the burden of this? This can be at the very local level, this can be at the national level, this can be at the global level. So environmental injustices has been important, but so is the issue of trust in each other in order to push these arguments forward. Science has become an increasingly important aspect of the consensus building that is required, because science is seen as more neutral, which also means that the science has to be a legitimate science that many participate in, and the North and the South and the various groups have their representation in it. Also, going forward, you will see that in these negotiations, as we try to push the environmental ambitions, as countries of the North sometimes push the environmental ambitions, the countries of the South agree to these in the negotiations through an ask on finance, on technology, on greater capacity, asks without which the environmental ambitions cannot be met, because even if you agree to these things, in order to implement them, all of these are required. And so there is a very clear understanding that if and when we push forward the environmental ambitions, globally we also need to look at issues of finance, we need to look at issues of technology and capacity. So if you think about all of these things, and then the fact that in all of these meetings you've had many voices speaking, it's no longer just government speaking, but it's the youth speaking, it's the women speaking, it's indigenous people speaking, it's the CSOs speaking. All of these multiple voices are resulting in a much more inclusive multilateralism. And this inclusivity is leading to more effective multilateralism, we believe. The youth, especially ever since 2021, have been incredibly engaged, not only in climate change, but in all various different forms of environmental actions. And this speaks to the importance of their voices, because they are the ones that are going to inherit the earth. And so the kind of pressure that they create on all of us as leaders to be better stewards of what we're doing becomes very important. Let me speak a little bit about the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting. I was intimately involved because I was leading it from the United Nations Environmental Program side. And this is 50 years since 1972. Now, many of you will know 1972 as the first conference on human environment, and it's especially important for India because the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was so involved with it. And she made the point about the relationship between poverty and the environment, which really brought into the whole discussion the importance of looking at development and environment conjointly. I grew up with this, and for me, this is a very important image that always stayed in my mind. So when Stockholm Plus 50 came up and I was asked to help lead it from the UN side, I was really grateful for the opportunity because it allowed me to think through what needed to be done. The way the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting was designed was really an open architecture, allowing a number of groups to meet over the year 2021 for the meeting, which was going to be on the June 2nd, June 3rd, 22. So right through the year, there were discussions with youth groups, with regional groups, with indigenous peoples, with the civil society, in order to understand what were the key issues and the key concerns that needed to be addressed. And also to result in some kind of systemic thinking, because all of these spoke to each other, and this led to a much larger bottom-up global thinking, which would then come into the leadership dialogues that were held at the event itself. Now, a key aspect that came up during these meetings was the issue of environmental injustices. There were conversations around injustice between the developed world and the developing world on the environmental issues. There were discussions around state and non-state actors. There were discussions on generations, intergenerational and intragenerational. And there were discussions between groups, so the marginalized groups, the youth, the women, etc. So this became an important aspect of the discussion, apart from the then translation of this into trust. So Stockholm Plus 50 focused very much on the issues of trust, on the issues of justice. And then it went on to look at what is it that really required to be done to make the changes that are required. It had three principles: intergenerational equity, it had the issue of responsibility, and it had implementation opportunities that needed to be done. So through the meeting, there was no negotiated outcome because the resolutions, UN General Assembly resolutions that set this up and set the theme, which is a healthy planet for the prosperity for all. This theme and this discussion, the General Assembly decided not to have a negotiated outcome, which, while in the beginning seemed like a dampener, it actually worked well because it was an opportunity for everyone to talk much more freely without the brackets that you normally see in negotiations. And so you had a lot of very good ideas that came out of that meeting, and I would strongly urge you to have a look at the official records which are available on the website, and which will give you a sense of what is the world talking about in terms of environmental matters. But there were 10 recommendations which came out from this, which required or suggested that people should be at the center of a healthy planet, and that was very important. That it was very important to recognize the human right to a healthy environment, which at that time in June had not been recognized yet by the General Assembly. Very importantly, that we needed to look at economic transformations, because all along the discussions are more about laws and rules, but we needed to look at how the economic system was creating the kind of environmental impacts that we're talking about. And this required a whole value chain approach. So take plastics, for example. You don't just look at the end of pipe of plastics, but you look at the whole life cycle of plastics. You look to see where is it that one can make a difference, who are the stakeholders in every part of the value chain in order to create that change that was required. And this is important for all the sectors that are so key to making that change towards a greener environment and a more sustainable development. So that includes mobility, that includes transportation, that includes food, housing and construction, and of course the energy sector. And so the focus now is on how to create this transformation in these different sectors using value chain approaches, but also how to align finance with these sectors, because finance is very often the lifeblood. And so if we align the finance sector with the real economy for the changes that we need, it really makes for a strong push in the actions that we need. And UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, has a dedicated finance initiative which is involved with exactly this, how to align the finance sector with the economic sector. So as a result, there were lots of good ideas put on the table, but I'll pick just 3 or 4 which, going forward can also influence other global processes on environmental governance. They already are influencing as we speak. One is the fact that it's really important to bring in ethics and responsibility into environmental governance and stewardship. And it's really important to move away just from talking to one set of groups, but talking to all of them. And here, faith groups, religious leaders, the youth play a big role, because you have a huge constituency and you are in a position to influence the consumption choices. Especially the youth can bring about a change in the kind of production patterns by just what you decide to consume. We call this aspirational consumption, and the idea of linking aspirations with sustainability. How can we do this? That's a subject matter for another talk, but just to say that the youth have great power to create that change in consumption that is required for the economic transformation. Religious leaders have a great power in themselves because they speak to so many millions. And so they are in a position to speak not only from the environmental point of view, but environment and justice and human well-being. So these have to be looked at very much in an interconnected fashion. So this then becomes the first point. The second point is the point on economic transformations, that we don't just look at legal issues, but we go beyond to look at economic transformations, which are important. Third is to look at intergenerational equity. The 1972 Declaration already spoke to intergenerational equity, to be concerned with what is it that we are leaving for future generations? What is our responsibility towards the future generations, for today's generations, but also to the future generations? And therefore it becomes really important that we have the long view, that we don't take short-term interests into account, that choices are made, always trying to understand where this will take us to. A fourth point that came out, which I think is of importance to environmental governance, is this inclusive, effective multilateralism. That we don't just speak to one group, but we bring all these voices together in order to be able to get a much clearer understanding of what's required. Elinor Ostrom called it polycentric governance, and that might be a very useful thing even for India and Goa, given the various ecosystems that we have, given the various groups that we have, and given the really vivid and robust civil society groups that we have here working on the environment. Finally, there were certain capacity initiatives that were launched, and I'll just speak to two of them. One, which is a data-driven environmental solutions hub, which is to work on data which helps understand what the environmental issues are and how they link with development and other issues, and then how to build the capacity of countries that need it to address these planetary issues and development issues as they go together. Because the point that is being made again and again is that as the environment degrades, the development opportunities will decline. And so it is in our own self-interest to invest in environment in order to also be able to have more and better development opportunities in the future. They go very much together, whether you talk of ecosystem services or the goods that are required for development. And the other one is the Green Jobs for Youth Pact, which was launched, and you'll have all of these on the website. So I'm just giving you a taste of it, but if you just type Stockholm plus 50 Global or any of the other words that I mentioned, you will be able to get what I'm talking about. The Green Jobs for Youth is really to help the youth get ready for the green economy. Not just to keep telling everyone to go into a green economy, but start training youth to be able to be very much part of a green economic system. So, in short, Stockholm plus 50 was not for any one constituency or one group. It was a clear message that we all need to work together towards a stable, secure, and prosperous future for all of us as a common home, as only one earth that we have. So it's really important that we have a collective responsibility, both individual and collective, to be able to make the change that we need. And we can do it together. That's my message today. Thank you very much.